In Clash Royale, cards don't just appear out of nowhere. Every card starts as an idea, a concept, a mechanic or design the dev team experiments with before we ever get to play with it. And sometimes those early versions look nothing like the card we ended up with. Some cards had completely different abilities, some had mechanics that were way too broken to ever make it into the game, and for others, we've seen the early concept art, and let's just say they've become something completely different. So in today's video, we're comparing some of the craziest early concepts to their final versions. Now, quickly, if I sound a bit off, I'm currently sick, so there's that. Anyway, to start off this video, I want to go back to how Clash Royale itself used to look. Because if we look at the game's original concept, we can already see how very different it was from what we know today. It was so different, in fact, that it wasn't even called Clash Royale yet. Back then, it was actually known as a project called Wizard Arena Clash of Clans. There was no King Tower, there was this strange little roundabout in the middle, and instead of Princess Towers, there were these weird crystal-looking things. But even with all of that, you can already see it. You can see Clash Royale's DNA. Now, we know this because of a book called The Art of Supercell, which I bought specifically for this video, so you're welcome. Anyway, before Clash Royale was, well, Clash Royale, the game's vibe was actually way more focused on fantasy, but at some point the dev team realized that if they wanted players to instantly understand the game, they needed something familiar. So, instead of building everything from scratch, they started pulling troops directly from Clash of Clans, like the Barbarian and the Archer. Or what they would do is they would give existing characters some small twists. Think of cards like the Spear Goblins and Goblin Barrel. These decisions made the game feel recognizable right away, and that made it way easier for players to get into it. But they couldn't just only use ideas from Clash of Clans. They needed new characters, and so we see the Knight come to life as a refined Barbarian, and the Musketeer can be traced back to the Archer. And while making these new troops, the team noticed something interesting. These new designs didn't just feel like new troops, they felt royal. And this idea of royalty didn't just create new cards, it created an entirely new identity for the game. One where battles weren't about looting villages like Clash of Clans, but about entertainment. And that's where it was decided it would be named Clash Royale instead of Wizard Arena Clash of Clans. From an Instagram post from 2018, we can see that at first we had a wizard standing at the center instead of a king tower, which shows that they still had this wizard idea in mind, but eventually it was clear. The team needed something different, something to make the game feel truly royal. And that's how we ended up with the king that we know and love today. We can see that the king originally had orange hair and he low-key looked more like the Royal Giant. And speaking of the Royal Giant originally had blue hair and a bit of a different outfit, but at least these looked quite similar. Now, let's put all of that aside because I want to talk about the first true concept on this list. Before the Firecracker was ever the card hated by half the player base,
kill the evolved Firecracker, bro, is juking everything.
She behaved differently, looked different, and even had a completely different name. Her first design was way more military-like and a lot closer to the Musketeer. Back then in development, she was also called the Rocketeer.
The first version was actually called Rocketeer.
Instead of one clean shot, she would fire what Seth described as a multi-rocket, basically a bunch of rockets flying out in a chaotic pattern. It looked cool, sure, but it made her insanely inconsistent. You couldn't really control what you were hitting, and because of that, the idea was changed into one big rocket that would split into multiple smaller projectiles on impact. And fun fact, this idea was actually inspired by Penny from Brawl Stars. Once her mechanics changed, the name Rocketeer didn't really fit anymore, and that's when creative director Bryce suggested the name Firecracker, and it instantly stuck. Now look, as much as I hate the Firecracker, I can't lie, seeing how she started out makes her a lot more interesting, and honestly, it makes me hate her just a little bit less. But the same definitely cannot be said for the Skeleton Barrel, because man, I fucking hate facing this card. But funnily enough, it wasn't always a barrel, and it wasn't even always filled with skeletons either. But before I show you its origin, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of effort into researching and editing these videos, and your support helps me out a ton. Back in December of 2018, Seth was giving a presentation during the Brawl Stars global launch, and that's where he revealed the original concept for the Skeleton Barrel. At first, it was actually this little caravan filled with something like gnomes. That caravan idea then evolved into a Trojan horse concept with goblins hidden inside of it. And that idea would eventually turn into what we now know as the Skeleton Barrel. But here's where it gets really interesting. In that same presentation, Seth also talks about the Goblin Drill coming from that exact same caravan Trojan horse concept. But in this presentation, he says that the Goblin Drill was scrapped.
But then another idea of a Goblin Drill, a drill that came up from the ground and released a bunch of goblins, didn't it?
Which at the time was true. But 2.5 years later, in July of 2021, the Goblin Drill finally did release, with a design that looked almost identical to the presentation back in 2018. But even before the December presentation, the Goblin Drill was already leaked in June of 2018.
Goblin Drill is apparently the newest card coming out inside of the game. Supposedly, it's going to be a 3 elixir legendary building. And take a look at this artwork here. If you guys check out the Goblin Drill, it looks pretty sweet. Basically, what you can do with the Goblin Drill, supposedly you can drop it anywhere on the map. So basically, it drills from underground. And from the Goblin Drill, there's actually little goblins that spawn out of it. Not spear goblins, regular stab goblins spawn from this. So it's a 3 elixir spawner building that you can play anywhere on the map.
And there was even some actual gameplay footage that surfaced. Of course, when it finally released 3 years later, it wasn't a 3 elixir legendary like the leak suggested. It ended up being a 4 elixir epic building instead. But still, it's really cool to see how one single idea went from a caravan with gnomes to a Trojan horse to being considered scrapped, and then finally released years later as a real card. One thing I wish wasn't a real card though is the Elixir Golem. Maybe the Elixir Golem we have now isn't that bad when we hear about its original concept. The first time we ever heard about the Elixir Golem was in an episode of Radio Royale in February of 2017. Here, instead of calling it the Elixir Golem, they call it the Elixir Monster.
What would you consider the craziest troop that we've tried?
Craziest. It might have to be the Elixir Monster.
But it's clear that they're talking about the same concept. The concept they're talking about is the Elixir Golem splitting into 2 smaller Elixir Mites, but in this version, the Elixir Mites would regrow into full size if left alone, which actually kind of ended up happening in the new Chaos game mode, where one of the Elixir Golem modifiers spawns Elixir Blobs that can turn into Elixir Mites. But even outside of this Radio Royale episode, we actually have some sort of concept model for the Elixir Golem years before it was released. In an April Fool's joke in 2017, Clash Royale posted a screenshot of an extremely chaotic 8v8 mode. And if we take a look at the right side of this screenshot, we see something that looks awfully similar to the Elixir Golem. The only real difference being that it has teeth. And as dumb as the current Elixir Golem is, I think we can consider ourselves extremely lucky that we didn't get this monstrosity instead. Now, in this same Radio Royale episode, they speak about something called the Butterfly Spell, which is actually the early concept for the tornado.
Mangs, can I talk a little minute about the butterfly spell?
Oh, you mean tornado?
No, it was originally the butterfly spell.
Instead of the tornado pulling troops in, the butterfly spell would distract any units with butterflies and pull them in that way. However, this could have been visually confusing, so the dev team opted for the tornado instead. Now, the Mighty Miner has gone through a few interesting phases as well. Interestingly, he could have been named Chief Miner, but the overall design for him was pretty clear from the start. His drill, however, has seen quite some iterations. There is a version where the drill seems to be powered by Elixir, a manual drill, and even a version where the Mighty Miner has completely swapped out his right arm for a drill. But the craziest one has to be him wielding a pickaxe instead of a drill, because I'm not even sure how his attacks would have worked. Now, in the art book I bought, we see even more interesting changes to some cards. The bowler originally was more blue and had hair, which I hate, and the hunter had a good variety of different weapons. But that's not all, because we also see something like the Rascal Boy having a pitchfork instead of a wooden sword, and something like the Magic Archer had an outfit very similar to the Mother Witch, and even one that looks really similar to the Ice Wizard. So maybe he would have originally shot slowing arrows? I'm not sure. Then the Dark Goblin has different masks, and is that an early concept of the Skeleton King holding a bottle of fucking mouthwash? Then the Ram Rider originally was a Wolf Rider, which I think looks cooler, but a wolf attacking a tower didn't make as much sense, so they went with the Ram. The Royal Ghost used to look like this, and would behave more like a bandit with a stun effect, and look at this guy. He was gonna be part of the Bowler family, and he would have a really long bandit dash, but then the helmet would break off, and he could no longer dash. Anyway, there's just so many cool concepts that turn into cards in different ways. But a concept doesn't always have to be an early sketch or scrap design like I've been showing you. Sometimes the idea comes from something that actually existed in the game before. Take the Evolved Mortar as an example. There might not have been an original concept for it, but I do think it came from a temporary card called the Barbarian Launcher. The Barbarian Launcher is a temporary card that was basically a mortar that, well, launched barbarians. And now let's take a look at the Evolved Mortar. a mortar that launches goblins. They clearly couldn't make it barbarians for the mortar evolution as it'd be way too broken, so goblins were the obvious pick here. But what's interesting is that the barbarian launcher was released on the 1st of August 2022, nearly a full year before we ever even heard of evolutions. And it also goes the other way around. Sometimes a card concept can be so overpowered that the only way to bring it into the game is with a temporary card. Remember the Super Mini P.E.K.K.A? For if you don't, the Super Mini P.E.K.K.A was a temporary legendary card and it behaved almost the same as a regular Mini P.E.K.K.A. Almost. The key difference being that the Super Mini P.E.K.K.A dealt infinite damage and could one-shot everything, including the King Tower. Now, you might be wondering why I'm bringing any of this up. Well, remember that Radio Royale episode I spoke about earlier? There was one other card I forgot to mention.
So Bangs, what failed card have we made and tested that you would like to see back?
I'd like to see Mega P.E.K.K.A.
Ooh, Mega
Mega
P.E.K.K.A.
P.E.K.K.A.
Yes, I love Mega P.E.K.K.A.
And we've been messing around with different sort of mechanics that he could do. I think one of the first ideas was infinite damage.
The Mega P.E.K.K.A could one-shot anything, much like the Super Mini P.E.K.K.A. But it would probably end up being way too strong for normal gameplay, so my theory is that the Super Mini P.E.K.K.A spawned from this idea. And I also think that the Super Mini P.E.K.K.A then inspired the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. You see, the Evolved P.E.K.K.A heals every time it takes out a troop. Now take a look back at the Super Mini P.E.K.K.A. Every kill grants him a pancake that can heal him. And keep in mind that at this time, the only healing cards we had were the Battle Healer and Heal Spirit. So I don't think I'm completely crazy for thinking this. Now, I just mentioned the Battle Healer and the Heal Spirit, and to be honest, I also have reason to believe that the Heal Spirit inspired the Battle Healer. The very first concept for the Heal Spirit literally has a sword, but I digress. Anyway, if you enjoyed, please again consider subscribing, and YouTube thinks you'll like this video, so you should see if they're right.